Now, most of the videos I upload on this channel are about old abandoned railways and what's left of them. There are just so many that I never knew about before. In New York City, this is no exception. The city is filled with disused tracks that are opened over a century ago, with most of them finding their origins with the Long Island Railroad. It has gone to a point where people see them as a disturbance and seek to transform them into something else, like a park. If you saw my last two videos, then you would see that this was the case for the Central Railroad of Long Island and the Putnam Division. Well, this is also the case for a section of track on the west side of Manhattan, which was once owned by the New York Central Railroad. Today, the High Line is a well-known greenway that you can take a lovely stroll on near the Hudson River. However, its history with the railroad can still be seen on the trestles. We're starting way back in the 19th century, 1847 to be exact. The city of New York allowed for construction of railroad tracks along 10th and 11th Avenues, on the west side of Manhattan in the Meatpacking District. These tracks would belong to the New York Central Railroad, and they would be utilized to transport freight trains that carried materials such as coal, dairy products, and beef. Now, since the trains ran on the street, there was a considerable danger to regular cars or people who were walking. In order to prevent any accidents, West Side cowboys rode on horses in front of the trains and waved flags. Regardless, so many accidents occurred that 10th and 11th Avenues were both known as Death Avenue. Estimates say that there were over 2,000 casualties along 11th Avenue in train-related accidents. This was a great concern of many people coming into the 20th century. So, an agreement was made for the West Side Improvement Project. As part of this, ground-level tracks will be removed and put onto elevated viaducts. This project was overseen by New York City Park Commissioner Robert Moses, who was responsible for the creation of many modern suburbs and highways in New York City. The West Side Improvement cost more than $150 million, $2.26 billion in today's money. By 1941, the last section of street-level track for this section was removed for 11th Avenue. But the first train to run on the newly constructed viaduct was in 1933. As a result of tracks being elevated above the ground, trains could now run through buildings. This would allow them to directly connect to factories, which would be easier to load and unload goods. Unfortunately, during the 1950s, a growth in interstate trucking led to a gradual decline in traffic. Interstate trucking grew because of construction of new highways, some of which were overseen by Robert Moses. In 1960, the St. John's Freight Terminal closed, and along with it, the southern section of the line. By 1978, only 2 loads of cargo were transported on the section. The last train to run on the line was a 3-car train, which carried frozen turkeys. After its abandonment, the trackway to the elevated viaduct was demolished. Also during this time, the section fell under the control of Conrail. During the 1980s, various property owners called for the complete demolition of the freight line, but there was opposition from activists who suggested that the line be reinstated. In fact, the MTA even proposed to build a light rail system on the viaduct, but nothing came out of that. While there was debate on what to do with the abandoned line, the trackways themselves started to deteriorate and nature began to take over. In an effort to protect it from demolition, an organization called Friends of the High Line was formed in October of 1999 by Joshua David and Robert Hammond. They pushed for its reuse as a public greenway like other ones in the world. However, they had to act soon because demolition was threatening the structure. At the turn of the 21st century, CSX, who owned the section at the time, allowed for the photography of the old and rusty tracks so that they could be shown to persuade people for a greenway park. In 2003, Friends of the High Line sponsored a competition in which people proposed designs and other structures that would be featured on the greenway. In September of the same year, the plans were officially announced to the public, and $50 million were set to establish the park. Then, in 2005, ownership of the High Line was handed over to the City of New York. In April of 2006, work began to transform the line into a parkway. 3 years later, the southernmost section opened from Gainsborough Street to 20th Street. Construction on the second section immediately began and was opened on June 7, 2011, from 20th Street to 30th Street. Construction on the final segment began in September of 2012, and the full High Line Greenway was opened 2 years later. Then, in 2018, an extra section was opened over 10th Avenue and 30th Street. Currently, there are plans to extend the High Line to the Moynihan Train Hall and the Hudson River Park. Note that this new extension will require the construction of new viaducts and not an existing one that was part of the New York Central Railroad. Now I'm going to start at 34th Street and work my way through the 1.45-mile stretch of the High Line. At the ramp that leads up to the viaduct, the rails are already visible in the pavement. They even extend beyond the entrance under a fence. Most of the High Line still retains its tracks, with some even covered in bushes, but we'll see that later. Once you fully walked up to the ramp and are parallel to the Hudson River, you get a good look at the entirety of the West Side Yard, where Long Island Railroad train cars are stored after they terminate at Penn Station. Then you walk until you turn left again, where at this point, you can look across the West Side Yard to see the starting point. Here, you are making a C curve as the viaducts start to head between buildings. Now, as you near 10th Avenue, the path curves right, but you can see here a short stub that continues straight. This is the provision of where the extension will build off from. Now, like I said, the tracks are still here, although they're pretty obscured. As you pass this row of benches, you can start to see the natureness of this park, as flowers and grass start to become more prominent. And then, you get to a point where the rails are literally on the floor of the walkway. If there's one thing I'm grateful for, is that they are willing to keep the old remnants of the freight line to remind you about its past. Then, it's a half mile of basically the same thing over and over and over. Oh, at least that track is still there. Don't worry though, because just after the viaduct crosses over 10th Avenue, you can actually start to walk through buildings, a clear hint at the line's past in transporting goods. This building here in Chelsea, which is now a food market, used to be the headquarters of the National Biscuit Company, or Nabisco. Yes, the same company who makes Ritz, Oreos, and Chips Ahoy. The building was actually first constructed in 1890. It's here where the first Oreo cookie was invented as well. This could probably even warrant a video of its own in the future. Continuing forward, you will walk under 2 more buildings, and yes, all the while, the track is still there. Now just after crossing 12th Street, you can look to the right and see a cool switch track hidden within the bushes as you near the end of the greenway. Now, the final stairways to head down are right here, but the viaduct actually continues for a short bit. This is a clear sign that the freight line continued even further, but unfortunately, the Greenway Park itself ends here, and buildings are now in the place of the right-of-way. So, there's nothing else to see, right? Well, there is actually an abandoned remnant at the corner of Bank Street and Washington Street, in which you can still see the trackway as it runs through the Bell Laboratories building. And here's a picture from 1936, showing a freight train running through that same building. Beyond this point, there are no other remnants of the old railroad, considering the fact that we are also beyond the existing High Line. The line would have continued for another mile, which you can trace on Google Earth until you get to the circular interior portion of a roundabout just south of the entrance to the Holland Tunnel. This is the exact location of where the St. John's Freight Terminal once stood, which was the southernmost end of this freight line. So that finishes off my video about the High Line. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. My next video will be something other than exploring an old abandoned railway, so stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.